Keron, what's going on, good buddy?
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
That's good.
I'm doing all right.
That's a good status considering it's 2020 and everything that's going on.
Everything is not well, but fortunately I'm doing okay. I'm cooking, so
That's the art of an organizer to create some level of homeostasis in the midst of a storm. So
well, there you go. That's one way to put it.
that's right.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Taking it day by day like we can, celebrating the progress, pushing against the setbacks, and healthy. So I'm doing well, seeing how I can help as many people as possible in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I, but it's so funny because I always put you in New York, but you're in the South.
I'm in Charlotte.
Yeah.
I'm right up the road from you.
Yeah, yeah. In my mind, you're always in New York. I don't know why. I mean, obviously, because a lot of the Schott folks are in New York, but
That's right. That's right.
always.
So we're gonna wait probably a couple of minutes and naturally and see what we get, and then start up the conversation.
Sure thing.
So how are you gonna cook in the middle of this process?
So what I did was I prepped everything.
Okay.
I'm making this split peas soup.
Mmm.
So I prepped everything. It's all chopped, cut, diced, and then as soon as we get done,
Got
I
it.
maybe like 45 minutes. So by 7, I'll be in.
That's wonderful. Now, are you vegan or anything?
Yeah, these days I mostly eat just plants. Yeah,
Okay. All right.
that's part of the fun and like the creativity of cooking is like finding really interesting and tasty things to cook. So
Right.
it's been fun.
Mixing it up.
And of course, well, I mean, it's harder when you're like when I'm on the road a lot. So I before March, I spent a lot of time in airports,
Right.
and now I've been literally the last time I was on a plane was March 13th. So I've been.
Yeah, this is the longest period that I haven't been on a plane, I would have to say, in 20 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's, I've embraced it, enjoyed it. But like you, it's everything is much more difficult when you're traveling
Yeah,
to from diet to workout to every, part of it. So for us, this has been an opportunity to reset.
yeah, and I have embraced that fully. So we'll see what happens. In I don't know what the estimations are, but I've seen a couple in-person conferences like coming online for like October, November. So we'll see what people are trying to do.
Right, right. Let's see, we have a couple of folks that have joined us. Let's wait a couple more minutes and get the conversation started.
I thought I could log into Instagram on my computer, but the request to go live feature actually doesn't
That's right.
show
Look,
up.
I don't feel as bad. I thought I was the only one that made that mistake.
No, you can't. And I was like, is it a pop-up being blocked? But
Yeah, I worked it out.
I think we're gonna avoid politics today.
You know what? What's interesting is we can't avoid politics.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
we are going to maintain our 501c3 status. But I think from a policy perspective, from a, long-term planning perspective, I think that has to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Definitely. For those who have joined us, we're just going to wait a couple more minutes to see if we can get a few more people in the space and have this conversation and seek to answer the question whether American cities love Black people. It's a huge question, but I think in between the answering the question, there's a lot of context and a lot of insight that we hope that will be revealed. So thank you for joining us.
I started listening. I sound like a Luddite, but I started listening to this podcast. It's literally called Nice White Parents.
Is that right? Where is it?
So I just have the podcast app.
Okay.
Some of the folks who produced This American Life. And what is happening is that they are following a school in New York, in Brooklyn, through almost, I think, 60 years of like integration, and sort of tracking the influence of like these liberal white parents on like both the structure and the success of the school, and pointing out the ways in which sort of liberal whiteness actually stands in the way of real progress. It's like there are 4 episodes in so far. So if you have some time,
okay,
check it out. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and Robin DiAngelo talks about that little in White Fragility, how at times white progressives, in many cases, become the worst advocates for the movement to elevate people of color.
And that so she did an interview with Mark Lamont Hill, right, where he sort of asked her about that, and I was reflecting on the fact that like in our day-to-day lives, Mark was saying like in systemic stuff, it's not necessarily the white liberal, but like in our day-to-day lives, in our organizing, in our coalition building, in our efforts to build campaigns,
mm-hmm.
Even from my own experience, white liberals or white folks who count themselves as liberal, like often are doing some real shady shit.
That's right. That's right.
I spent a lot.
There are good intentions to address systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
They consume too much space in the process.
Absolutely.
Because their progressive nature seems to make them believe that they have rightfully earned the ability to consume that space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's right on target. So thank you for joining us, Keron and John. And Keron, thank you. And you asked the question earlier, if we are going to avoid politics. I don't think there's any way to avoid politics. And, I want to start this conversation off a little with politics in the sense that I would be remiss. I mean, you immigrated from Jamaica, and we have now someone who with Jamaican ancestry who has been nominated for vice president, first Black female. So big ups to Vice President Biden. What do former Vice President Biden, what are your thoughts about this moment?
I have a lot of thoughts, and I think as it like pertains to even the conversation we're trying to have, for me, the real measure of any of the validity of this is around whether or not and to what extent we can ask the question, do these people, whoever they are, Kamala, Biden, do they love Black people, and where, in terms of their policies and their practices, does that love actually show up, right?
That's right.
In my experience, I do think that, we have to celebrate. So part of me, I went to Howard, I'm Jamaican, so a lot of, everybody on my Facebook is like celebrating and there's reason to celebrate, right? A Black woman on the ticket. I think representation matters, but I worry and I haven't worried publicly because I want to give people space to like feel all the good things that come with, you know, Harris on the ticket. But I do worry about the limitations of representational politics.
That's right.
I also worry that the conversation seems to be happening in these two extremes. So one, there's a complete dismissal of what a Harris Biden ticket might and could do for even issues that we care about, like public education, and saying, well, it doesn't matter. They're going to be the same old, same old. I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think that's entirely too dismissive. But on the other extreme is this idea that any criticism is us being too woke. You know, so the other meme I've seen people share a lot is don't be so woke that you tear down a Black woman. And I think those two extremes don't quite get at the heart of the real conversation that I think we need to be having, right? That yes, we can be happy about, you know, folks being nominated or winning nominations and running for president, and there are real things at stake. But as you and I know in the work that we do, there are real tests for progressivism. There are real tests for Black liberation. There are real tests for whether or not Black people are better situated under any administration. And we can't abandon that charge to put and to evaluate whether or not people are living up to the hype that they've sold us. And so, you know, I lean in, but I'm also worried and committed to providing the kind of critical feedback that we know actually moves candidates and move issues.
That's right. Yeah, I thought it was a very uplifting move. I was happy to see it happen, especially considering the commitment that Black women specifically have made to the Democratic Party. They've carried the Democratic Party for decades. So I thought it was necessary. And then to your point, on the other side, we've got to recognize that, you know, racism is an operating system for America. And just as we have these cell phones, if you add an app, that still doesn't change the operating system. So I can add a weight loss app, a workout app to my phone.
Yeah.
But if the operating system of the phone sends me notifications around Krispy Kremes or Popeyes, things that don't move me forward, just having the app alone won't change the system.
Absolutely.
And in many respects, I think that the appointment of people of color to offices, it's necessary because we are more likely to interrogate the operating system, but it's not sufficient in getting us to where we need to go. So progress in that I do believe that she provides some capacity to begin to interrogate America's operating system, and she and the vice president will need people on the outside who are pushing for a new operating system.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's you know,
and is that to get, you know, one of the things I think that they're missing right now, and again, even the report that you all have done, the work we've done together at Eros, there is no big idea coming out of this camp. And so for me, I'm sort of like, this, you know, we talk about education issues. We are not proposing radical ideas. We are actually proposing ideas that when you talk to the majority of people in this country, they actually agree with us, right? That schools should be well resourced, that we should fund Title I, that we should make sure that we, you know, all this stuff. And so for me, I just worry that, again, in our effort to move the electorate, right? And as a rule, I never blame the electorate, right? It is the responsibility of candidates in a democracy to appeal to the interests of an electorate to move them. And so if we look at what they are presenting, I'm not finding big ideas, and there are big ideas at the ready, from how we make public education more equitable, to what we do about student debt, to what we do about teacher pay and teacher readiness, to what we do about policing. Like, there are some big ideas that this set of candidates could grab onto in order to move people in the direction they want to move them. And we haven't seen it at this point.
Well, you know, we raised this, you know, at Schott you mentioned the report, the Loving Cities Index, which we released in July. And as you know, the framework of the Loving Cities Index is really built around the fact that for decades, and specifically in education, the educational system has really focused on standards and accountability. And
Yeah.
as we talk to community partners, students, and parents, they're not asking for more assessments. They're not asking for more accountability. The fundamental question that they're asking is whether this system loves my child,
Yeah.
or whether this system cares for me. And so we thought about there being a need for a new way to assess the supports that are available within a city, because there's clear data today that indicates that what happens, or the supports that students get outside of the classroom, as far as housing supports, healthcare, transportation, is as important in a student's opportunity to learn as the things that we talk about within the classroom. Absolutely. Class size, resource equity. So we wanted to measure that. And as a colleague often says, racism is nothing but institutionalized lovelessness. So we wanted to measure to what degree were the cities creating systems that were evident that they love the families and children within the city, and provided them an opportunity to learn. So I think that it's very important that we begin to sort of change the narrative from this autocratic tone of accountability and assessment, and really speak to the values of parents and students, and the values that are around love, care, commitment, and stability. And that's what we try to get to in the Loving Cities Index, where we looked at 10 cities, and now it's 20 cities when you count the report from 2018. You know, Keron, you and I have been in some similar places. You know, I grew up in Chicago. I spent some time in New Orleans while I attended Xavier University. And so we've seen similar places. Chicago had challenges pre-COVID.
Yep.
Still challenges around violence, still challenges around giving young people the supports that they need to have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. New Orleans is still recovering from Katrina pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And so, you know, my question is, from your experience, now that we've both sort of lived and experienced this COVID moment while watching these cities, you know, what do you think is the way forward for many of these American cities, and the way forward for what is the approach that families and students should take in addressing where we are today?
Can I cuss on here?
I believe you can.
Let me tell one of the reasons why I love sort of even the title of the report. You know, you talked about Xavier. I went to Howard, HU, and one of the things that, you know, every Sunday, if you went to Howard, we would have different speakers at chapel. One of them was Cornel West, and one of the things he always said that stuck with me throughout my undergrad and my seminary years was that justice is what love looks like in public. And so this question of, does America love Black people, love Black children, as you know, gets at this question of, we measure that, we determine that based on the level of justice that we are seeing. And so from where I'm sitting, and we say this often, to be clear, public education, public schools work. They work in many parts of the country. There are millions of children and families who attend public schools who would die to preserve them in their communities. But there are far too many Black children, in particular, brown children, immigrant children, who attend public schools that are grossly under-resourced. And it is not because we don't have the resources, it is because we lack at the governmental level, the political will to resource these schools. And so for me, the way forward, and I don't want to set it up like this big aha moment, is not really complicated, right? Like the cities you talk about, New Orleans, Chicago, New York, any major city, one, we have to lead with equity, right? We have to say that we have to address decades, if not centuries, of unequal and inequitable distribution of resources. That's one. So stuff like funding Title I, funding IDA fully, right? Making sure that schools have and that the money is actually going to schools that stand in need. Then we also need local control, right? That when decisions about a community or a child's future are being made away from that community, detrimental things happen. So we need local control. We need apparatuses for parents to be involved in decision making, right? So we need resources. We need local control and access to the levers of power. We need elected school boards, right? So in Chicago, the school board is not elected. And again, in Chicago, 6 years ago, we saw massive school closings, which in the neighborhood I lived in, a couple of schools were closed, and then 2 years later, those became high-rise condominiums, right? So we have to fund, we have to resource schools. We need a curriculum that is relevant to the world we live in, and to the future that we are preparing young people to take on. And those things they're not mind-blowing or incredible. One of our partners, the Journey for Justice Alliance, talks about what they call sustainable community schools.
Right.
Lay out a whole model, some of the recommendations that you all lift up, right? So the way forward is political will to resource schools, invest in schools equitably, leading with race, making sure that we are preparing young people for bright futures, parent and community engagement, curriculum that reflects the new world that we're living in, well-resourced and well-paid educators who are committed to learning, ending the reliance on standardized tests, making sure that we aren't funding schools by property taxes alone. Like, these are things that people have been saying for decades, and we have lacked, particularly in Black, Brown, and immigrant communities, the political will to make them happen. And my hope is that we can usher in, even in November, political leadership that will lead on some of those things. And we also have to get rid of Betsy DeVos and get a capable Secretary of Education.
So let me ask you this. Let me push a little, because you talked about earlier the need for big ideas, and many of the things that we're talking about, fully funding Title I, and the other pieces, previous administrations have also talked about. Mm-hmm. Obviously, education advocates have lost some ground during this administration, mm-hmm. but it sort of begs the question in the back of my head that even if we make some gains there, will we still close mm-hmm. these learning gaps? When in Jackson, Mississippi, we see only 51% of Black parents having access to affordable housing. Mm-hmm. When in Chicago, we see challenges, and you mentioned the gentrification that happens, but we see challenges in access to healthy food. Mm-hmm. What's the big idea that connects everything that we just outlined in education to the very fact that unless we address these larger systemic pieces, which are the emblematic expression of love, because you don't starve those who you love. Mm-hmm. You don't let those who you love go without clothing. So when we talk about love, no, we're not talking about this kumbaya moment.
Absolutely not.
We're really talking about creating systems that really allow families to access the supports that they need, so that love is evident, and that they have the opportunity to learn. Mm-hmm. How do we connect the two? Because you and I have been in enough of the education speak rooms, mm-hmm. and we have struggled to also pull in our housing justice colleagues, mm-hmm. and our livable wage justice colleagues, mm-hmm. and we're going to need them if we're going to push cities to love our young people.
So I agree with that, and I do think that, to your own point, that the big idea and a part of perhaps the next phase of our movement, and there is work on this, right? There was an action third, where, you know, on a lot of the movements that you talked about, ed justice, housing, minimum wage, came together to say, we want to create space for our work to intersect. And
That's
even
right.
those people don't sit at the same coalition table. A lot of the activists that I know are clear that all of these things intersect. So the big idea is, again, an administration, whether it be at the city, state, or federal level, that accepts that these things are interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot talk about fixing schools if we don't talk about addressing the inequities and inequalities that exist in the communities that those schools exist in. But here's the thing, and that's not one of the things. I'm not a fantasy person, but when I think about the fact that in the 60s, 70s, Jill Scott Heron wrote this poem called Whitey on the Moon. And he says, my sister Nell got bit by a rat, but Whitey's on the moon. And I love that, because what it does, it says, it lifts up this idea that the concerns of white folks, the concern of white governments, has always been far and above the realities of Black people. And so if we can figure out how to get to the moon and mine the moon for resources and get to Mars, and if we can invest money into that, we can map out the poorest communities in America. We can find the places with the greatest, amount of housing inequity, and we can provide the resources, both human and monetary resources, that can address a lot of those issues. Right. And so for me, the big idea is, how do we connect those things, but how do we fund and resource the solutions in ways that they actually work? Right. We know, again, your report highlights it. So we know where people are suffering, but we've never actually had the kind of financial and economic investment in these communities that allow them or set them up for success. And I think the hope is that we will get more of that in the next 4 years.
Yeah, and so as I hear you talk about it, I agree. And it seems that if you look at most cities, they don't have the infrastructure to love Black people.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't invested in the core infrastructure to provide the supports for families, regardless of what zip code they live in.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at South Florida and look at the very fact that, a few weeks ago, because of COVID-19, Jackson Memorial Hospital, which is the medical network in South Florida, which is to, serve that community, all of the ICU beds were full.
Mm-hmm.
Then there became a scenario where the patients were moved to Broward County. Mm-hmm. And now Broward County is filling the churn in their IC unit. What does that mean? Well, that means if we're traveling on I-95 and we just so happen to get in a car accident, there's nowhere for us to go. There's no infrastructure for us to go. When we talk about, Jackson and families not having access to healthy food, a young person going to school, yes, it is about class size. It is about getting, the resources, but it's also about, the making sure that that child can eat something or eat so that he or she is prepared to learn. So it sounds like we're also talking about an infrastructure agenda.
And an investment in that, right? So, where I lived in Chicago before New Orleans, and I was thinking last night, in my neighborhood, Chicago is one of the most racialized, racist cities. I think the census people are coming to my door.
So, you don't want to miss that.
Doorbell. No, I did it already. The doorbell will.
Okay, do it twice.
We're gonna ignore the doorbell, but we are talking about an infrastructure, right, investment. So I lived in Chicago, again, one of the most racialized, racist cities in America. But where I lived, there were 3 or 4 grocery stores, right, within walking distance of my apartment. Hell, there was a hardware store at the end of my block. There were restaurants. There was public transit that run, 24 hours. That did not happen. There were good jobs. That did not happen by accident. that happened because the city made decisions about where to invest, again, time and dollars and capital. And what I think what we are saying is, if America is to love Black people and Black children in real ways, then we have to make sure that communities where Black people are living have hospitals and healthcare access. There is adequate public transit. There is good food to eat. There are good schools, right? So, and those are not basic, but in a lot of ways, they are basic, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are too many. Where I live now in Georgia, South Fulton, right next to Atlanta, is one of, if not the Blackest city in America, right? And when you look at the infrastructure that is here, from jobs to food to heck sidewalk, right, it is severely lacking. And that's not, again, by accident. It is because wherever we find lots and lots of Black people and people of color, we find a record divestment rather than investment. And so we have to invest in infrastructure. And we know what those things are: schools, hospitals, public transit, grocery stores, businesses, good jobs. Basic shit that we are not doing in Black and brown and poor communities.
That's right. So let's pay homage to Jill Scott and take a long walk, because we're talking about America has the resources and the wealth to do these things. Let's talk about how America got those resources and wealth. We know that the genocide of Native people gave America, early colonists, the land that was necessary. We know that the enslavement of Black people gave America decades and centuries of free labor. We know that the annexation of Mexico territory gave America, almost half of the West Coast. Again, additional land and resources that come with that. And we know that the lockout of Black people as a part of the New Deal was another critical point where Black people, where America transferred wealth, but the wealth did not extend to people of color.
Yeah.
So we're taking this long walk. We're talking about infrastructure. Now we're at a point where there seems to be some affirmation that Black Lives Matter. There seems to be some desire to want to create a new America. Now we're in this COVID moment. And the question that's before us in this COVID moment is, should our children go back to school? And I've heard a lot of conversations around safety, which are warranted. We've got to be concerned about the safety of children and educators, and parents and families. I haven't heard conversations around how do we address, number one, the learning gaps that have already happened because of where they have been from March 2020 to the present, the learning gaps that will likely occur because of inadequate remote learning, pedagogy.
Yeah.
And so if we walk this to where we are, to where we need to be in November, we talked about election, to where what a president should do in their first 100 days. Give me some insight on how, from the decision to return to school, the decision of the first 100 days and moving forward, could really help to build a platform to create this new America that we seem to want to create.
Oh,
that's a small question.
Yeah, you ask big questions. So let me pick up on that first piece. I do not have currently school-aged children, right? So I'm always hesitant around should we not. And when I listen to Black parents, there is an interest in returning for all the reasons that you've said, right? Learning, making sure their children and their loved ones don't fall behind. And that is not superseded by concerns around making sure that it is okay to return. And when I've talked to Black parents, the thing they've said is, I much rather keep my child at home, figure out remote learning for some more period of time, not permanently, while we figure out how to make sure that our young people are safe. So that's at least what I'm hearing. And I'm also hearing the historic concern that Black children, Black bodies have long been the terrain of experimentation, right? So people are worried around, wait a minute, is it time yet? You know, so I think that's a real concern. And I'm also hearing from parents that if I have to return to work, right, childcare becomes a thing for my child who is now at home alone, right? So it is a complicated question. But what you said is also right, that a lot of the inequities that have been exposed and unearthed by COVID were not new to Black folks and Black parents. And people have been organizing, like I was saying to you at the top of the conversation, there's a podcast, Nice White Parents, that's sort of tracking one school over 60 years. And the report is finding that a lot of the stuff that they're dealing with today, folks were dealing with 30 odd years ago. So people have been organizing. So what we know is, and we've been working at Eros on what we're calling transformational schools post-COVID, and we're saying we cannot return to what things were.
That's right.
Right? Those are not options, and particularly for Black and brown and poor children, that is not an option, because a lot of schools were just not working for those communities. So that's one thing. I think in the 100-day mark of post-November, you know, one of the things that's been a hit to public education is that we literally, John, have at the head of the Department of Education a woman who has said that she does not believe in public schools and public education, and has a commitment to dismantling that infrastructure. So one of the first things that we have to see in the first 100 days or whatever is conversations about appointing someone to that role who actually believes in public schools and public education. I think the agenda after that has to lead with racial justice. Years ago, we did a report called Racial Justice is Education Justice. We have to lead with a commitment to equity. We have to lead with a commitment to ensuring that young people have infrastructure either for at home or in-person learning. And then we also have to do, as you suggested, the wraparound services that actually facilitate learning. So access to healthcare, access to food, access to internet at home, access to homework services, right? Those things also have to be present. And as the listening public, we have to no longer accept sort of the austerity argument that we cannot do this, we cannot afford it. In this pandemic, Jeff Bezos, who, you know, is the head of Amazon, has literally made, I forget the number, but billions of dollars. Amazon and Jeff and Walmart, these folks don't even pay taxes. So there has to be some conversation around, this is not about a lack of resources. It is about the lack of political will to invest in the communities that we care about. And if the pandemic has reaffirmed anything for us, is that as everyday people, we only move the needle when we use our bodies, we show up, we protest, we insert our bodies in places that make the system slow down and listen to us. And while we can raise demands, we're gonna have to do some deep and strategic organizing after November to make sure that everything we are talking about actually becomes a reality.
That's right. That's right.
Because they're not,
you know, as I
roll over and give that to us.
I agree, and it's you know, it's long overdue, and you know, I've talked a lot about this, you know, idea of, you know, if we really care and love Black children, Black families, families of color, in many respects, it has to be shown within the educational system.
Absolutely.
Because the educational system, while I believe that the public education system remains the best platform for opportunity in America, At the same time, it's time to liberate learning in many respects. And what I mean by that is liberating the time that students have to learn. We've been working from this 180-day learning schedule for far too long. It has given the appearance that Black and students of color are incapable of learning or achieve a level of competency and mastery, when the schedule is really just based on an agrarian calendar that is outdated. More high-performing countries have already moved to 200 days for learning and beyond, because what they've recognized is the science is such that students learn in different ways, and students specifically in America need more time to learn and less time to lose what they learn. So liberating, the time that students learn, also liberating where students learn. We've already talked about this, Keron. Learning happens for students even before they hit the schoolhouse or the school building, and after they leave the school building. But right now, our federal, state, and local dollars are really focused on learning happening in the school building. And now look at COVID. That opportunity doesn't exist, so we have to create the types of platforms where community is the learning platform. The school building is a platform for connecting students to the resources, and educators are looked upon as facilitators for that. Now, that won't be, you and I know, that won't be a new role for many teachers who teach Black and brown students across the country, because they've had to connect families to resources and they don't get paid, or they're poorly paid to do that part. But that has to be a part of a liberated learning agenda, liberate where students learn. And of course, you mentioned liberate what students learn. Absolutely. The cultural competency, the cultural relevance of the content that the students receive, and what they learn around justice. When we talk about removing police out of schools, and how that, this is, in many respects, our schools are the first place where our young people learn justice or injustice. And we don't want that introduction or that pedagogy to come from police officers. So we got to liberate what students learn and how we support learning. Absolutely. Property-based taxes don't work. No. There are states right now that use a property-based formula, but there's also states that send more money directly to schools, not based on property tax. So there's an opportunity to do this. And you mentioned, we've got to liberate how we measure learning. Standardized tests are not the best metrics for learning. There are formative assessments that can be used. There are different ways to learn, to integrate competency-based learning. We've got to get rid of high-stakes standardized test component and the overuse of standardized tests. If it is truly about creating a new America, we have to liberate learning. There are some people, and I'll be interested in getting your thoughts around this. There's some people that say, well, how do we pay for all of this? And you talked about the resources being there. And, prior to the 2008 recession, prior to, we're in this COVID moment, in both of those cases, we use economic stimulus packages to keep the economy afloat and to keep things moving. Do you think it's time for a racial equity stimulus package that is really focused to stimulate addressing racial disparities? And I'm not talking about a $1 billion.
Reparations, John?
Well, I would say this: yes and no. I think reparations is a much larger frame, because it speaks of financial and using the financial and legal lever. We've used the legal lever in the 50s and 60s, and we've seen some progress, but not totally all the progress. But to your point, we haven't seen the massive infusion of public resources to address eliminating racial disparities. The closest thing that we've seen was the New Deal. And we know that Black and people of color were shut out of the New Deal. What's your thought on the racial equity stimulus package?
My answer to that is yes. Don't ask me exactly what it looks like, because I'll trust you and others to figure that out. But I think so. I think so because the history of inequality, right? I forget her name, but right at the height of the George Floyd protest, I think it's Wilson, but she made this YouTube video where she talked about monopoly.
Okay.
And don't talk about looting, right? But you gotta. She said, what would happen if for 40 rounds we played monopoly and you weren't even allowed to like be on the board?
That's right.
And then she said, and then let's take another 50 rounds where you're allowed to play, but everything you do, every game you make, I can legally like take it from you. And you know, and she I mean, and we know this stuff, right? But she laid it out in a way that was so clear that said that for the entire history of Black people in this country, there have been obstacles is almost too insignificant a term to describe the challenges. But that Black people, so I get why Black people are excited about Kamala Harris being on a ticket and Barack Obama being president, because it required so much to get there, right? But for centuries, Black folks have been under the boot of the system that have pillaged and robbed and killed and murdered and snuffed our lives out.
That's right.
And prevented us from getting the kind of jobs that, you know, there are a lot of memes about, you know, Black barbers who, I mean, they give you a part or they give you a shape up and it's so precise. And it's like, this man would be in medical school were it not for systemic racism, right?
That's right.
I am for and in full support of any conversation around how do we begin to make directed investments in the lives of Black people and Black communities in this country to begin, not even to complete, but to begin the process of repairing the centuries of economic hardship that has been inflicted on Black bodies and Black community from this country. So yes, what it looks like, how we do it, I don't have those details, but it seems only fair to me. You know, similar to the New Deal, there was a recognition that in order for people to make it out, we had to actually invest broadly and widely and systemically. So we're talking about jobs, we're talking about making sure that people are paid well, we're talking about pensions and retirement, we're talking about canceling student debt, right? Those are the things that we have to talk about, broad-based infrastructure investment that at least begin to give Black people and Black communities in this country the opportunity to begin to make up the gaps. One of the books I read was Eloquent Rage, and in it, she talks about the fact that at this current rate, it will take the Black women in America 288 years to like even catch up to white women in America, right? So we're talking about it will take centuries for folks to be on the footing where the kinds of investments that were stolen from us even begin to be compensated. So I absolutely think we have to talk about directed and focused investments in the lives and communities of Black people in this country, if we're talking about love and justice.
Yeah, and I think it's a part of a restorative justice process for America. When you think about, you know, the critical points that we talked about, a country that generated its wealth based on the genocide of natives, took the land, the enslavement of Blacks, free labor, the annexation of Mexico territory, more land and resources, and transferring the wealth to white working class through a new deal that people of color were kept out of. So you capture all of that wealth, and that was the down payment on America. It was based on the bodies of Native, brown, Black, and brown bodies. So it's only right that now we take the resources, if the goal is to build a new America, we take those resources and invest them into addressing the disparities that exist. And I'm not talking about, you know, as I mentioned, it's going to take more than a $1 trillion investment, but it's going to be over a period. And this is where having a vice president who is a woman of color can, and giving her the resources at that point to lead this charge that would guide those resources to do the things that you talked about,
Mm-hmm.
addressing the wealth gap, which has to do with many of the indicators that we talked about in the Loving Cities report, housing affordability,
Mm-hmm.
because one of the greatest transfer of wealth is around property ownership, to help small businesses, investments in individuals. We already know that the U.S. has one of the most conservative family leave laws or paternity leave laws in the world. How then do we invest in people so that we're also investing in families? So I think that this is, the right thing to do. Having a vice president of color who can interrogate America's systemic racist operating system without the resources is less effective.
Mm-hmm.
This is a plan to also give the administration the resources, not only to interrogate the operating system, but disrupt it
Mm-hmm.
and build a new one. And every piece that we look at, and every city that we looked at in the Loving Cities Index, it was clear to me that the infrastructure of the cities were not strong enough to create the types of loving cities where all students can have an opportunity to learn and to thrive.
No, it's right on point. And again, there has whenever we get into the conversation around resources and investment, like so many people start to get squirmish, right? Years ago, I worked with Maya Wiley, and when she was at the Center for Social Inclusion, and she would always say that there is, in her mind, sort of that equity and justice is a floor beneath which no one is living,
Mm-hmm.
ceiling above which no one is living, right? That we have to talk about how we curtail and manage greed and massive amounts of wealth that is concentrated in the hands and the lives of a few. And we have to talk about the fact that a lot of that wealth is acquired on the backs of Black people, both contemporarily and historically. And if we want to talk about justice and loving Black people, then we have to talk about how we ensure that we are moving meaningful amount of resources into communities, and into the lives of Black people around this country. Like, there's just no way around it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we have a question from Figs One. Do you think there should be specific reparations for descendants of slaves and Native Americans, or should it be for all people of color, regardless of their historical experiences in the U.S.? Great question.
And I'm not an expert on this, but I go with all people, all Black people, right?
You got a lot of books behind you, so you.
Yeah. So I'm like, I was talking to a friend about that, and I think there are some red herrings and some sort of plot traps that are set up in some of these conversations around who deserves what and where. And I think the broadest, as an organizer, for me, the broadest conversation we can have is what gives us the most power to win on those fronts, right?
Right.
So when we start to dissect who is legitimately or Black enough to get support and resources, for me, it feels like a sort of a futile endeavor, because my mother came to this country when I was 11 years old and entering high school, 7th grade. And she came here because American foreign policy and European foreign policy was at the time decimating the economy of places in the Caribbean, like Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to talk about justice and it's sort of a global Black community, we also have to acknowledge that Black folks in the Caribbean, Black folks in South America, Black folks on the continent, Black folks in Europe are also suffering at the hand of colonialism and imperialism, right? So to me, that's a no-brainer, so.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why I frame it as a racial equity stimulus package,
Yeah.
because I think the data will indicate where the resources are needed and the groups that need the impact.
Mm-hmm.
And even today, if you look across data points, it's, Black people specifically are at the bottom of many of those data points.
Mm-hmm.
And where they're not at the bottom, you will find Native people at the bottom of many of those. So America, it's hard to separate the results and the outcomes that we see today
Mm-hmm.
from the brutal oppression that America used to get to today.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I couch it as an opportunity to decouple America's vision of opportunity and democracy from the tool of brutal oppression that they used to get here. It's an opportunity to decouple it and use an economic stimulus to help us get there. So I agree that the data will indicate that yes, the former slaves and natives are at the bottom of so many indicators where we would like to have them, race neutral. And what I mean by that is we should not be able to identify by race who's more likely to be successful and who's less likely to fail. That is an abnormality. That statistically just shouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in America, it's happened so long that it seems normal, but it's an abnormality.
Yeah.
And the financial stimulus, in my mind, would be stimulating the economy until we can no longer do that. Figs One also asked the question, should there be any reconciliation for descendants of slaves? She's getting directly to the point.
Again, to your point, I feel as though the thing you are lifting up, connected to the Love in Cities, connected to the report you are released, this sort of financial or stimulus or equity stimulus package is a little bit different from this broader conversation about reparations. Because again, as you see, once you start there, that's this rabbit hole that it's hard to get out of. But to the finer point you are making, I absolutely agree. I think the COVID and post-COVID moment, I think what we do around schools and ensuring equity, ensuring that America does show up and love Black children, I think one of the ways that we do that meaningfully is by supporting this proposal that you are making. And I think it doesn't solve everything, but it begins to get us on the right track, right, to address not just the contemporary inequities, but the inequities that, again, the folks at Schott have been tracking for so long, right? So that's what I'll say on that.
Yeah, and Figs One, I think that if we care about creating equity in home ownership, where race is not identifiable by race, if we care about creating equity and access to livable wages, where it's not identifiable by race, we will have to provide some level of reconciliation for those, descendants of slaves in order to get there. And what I'm proposing is that we use a financial lever to do it, because ultimately how it ties back to education, if we're not able to address these larger systemic inequities at a systems level, it's clear that we're not able to provide all students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
So the two are connected. The infrastructure is connected to investing in every family's ability to provide their child a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. So Keron, we've got 1 minute left. You got any closing remarks?
I go back to something I said earlier. All of what we're talking about, loving Black people, making sure Black children get justice both in and out of the classroom, is not possible unless everyday people join together, organize, take action in their communities, and push and bend the political will in our direction. And the work we've been doing at Arrows supports that. So
that's right. And we've got a big opportunity coming up in November, but we've got to do the work to get to November, to make sure that we practice being a part of a democracy. This election is significant, it's important, and not much of what we talked about can happen if we don't participate in the process.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Keron. I love having this conversation.
Get it.
Everyone have a blessed